This is our India ink practice exercise. The supplies you're going to need is a water cup, brushes, a pen, Bristol watercolor paper, some scrap, paper towels, ink, and a palette. So this is the page we're going to be working on. You can see I have my brushes, I have a palette. I'm just going to label it with India ink. And you can see my water cup up there. So I have a variety of tools and some paper towels. So we're going to start with a value scale. So you want to go from black to white. So remember, the white is simply going to be the paper. And then the black is going to be the pure ink. And I'm using a small round brush for this. And I'm just making little circles. If you want to make squares, that's fine. It's up to you. So I'm starting with the pure ink. No dilution with water. And then what I do is I'll take what's on my brush, that pure ink, and then I'll add a little bit of water to it. And then as I go along, I'll add a little bit more water to that. So you can see I'm going back and forth and testing it on some scrap paper first. And then so I just keep adding more water with what's on my brush. I'm never going back to the full, just pure ink. I'm always taking what's on my brush and adding more water. And then you can always go back once it's dry and add additional value to your swatches to create the range that you're looking for. So it's better to have it a little bit too light than it is to have it too black, because if it's too dark, there's no way to fix it. If that happens, just cross it out and make a new value scale somewhere else. Don't worry about wasting a bunch of paper. So you can see in those two, they're kind of similar. You can also get a paper towel and kind of use it to absorb some of the ink. And that also kind of helps if you end up getting things too dark at first. And the value also changes a little bit as it dries. It kind of lightens up. So don't really judge your work until it's dry. So try to do at least 6 or 7 different steps on your value scale. And then you can see I'm taking a little bit of a paper towel. And this paper that I'm working on is smooth Bristol. So depending on the paper you're using, it also is going to absorb a little bit differently. All right, so once we do our value scale, I want you to do a range of different types of washes. This is really similar to what I will have you do in watercolor, or if you've had watercolor with me, what I've had you do in watercolor. But the first is wet on wet. So what wet on wet means is you're going to wet the paper first. So I'm just using plain water. You could even use some with a little bit of pigment in there if you'd like. And then you're going to drop in some wet ink. And then you'll see it just kind of, the ink just disperses. So wherever there's water, the wet ink will go. And then you can also drop in some pure ink. And when we get to some other techniques, you'll see that's a technique for creating landscapes. And you can already see I added way too much black ink. But this is why we're practicing, is so we can kind of get the hang of it before we work on a final project. So there's a little bit too much black ink in there, but so you can see what happens. And then to fix it, you can, like I said, go back in with a paper towel and absorb a little bit. You can even use a Q-tip, but you can see when I absorb it, how that ink just kind of flows right back into the wet. So the second is just a wash. So a wash is just you're just trying to make a flat from side to side value. So I'm using a flat brush for this. I really like flat brushes for this. There's also a brush called a mop brush that's really good for washes. And then I'm just going back and forth And inevitably, you probably will have a little blob of a darker value. That's just kind of the way the ink works. A gradated wash is going from dark to light. And this is probably, for me, it's the most challenging one. And this is one where to get it perfect, you usually want to do a wash and then let it dry and then alter it a little bit. So I'm just using a middle value gray, and then I'm going to take some pure ink with a tiny bit of water and then put it onto the side and then allow it to just kind of flow. So it's almost like a wet on wet. And then I could also go back with a clean brush, but I'm kind of just letting the ink do its own thing. So I did a wash, and then I'm dropping in a darker value at one end, and I'm just letting the ink kind of blend itself to the end. And again, if it's not perfect, what you can do is just wait for it to dry and go back over it. And then you can see you can also pull it, and then I ended up pulling some of my darker value back there. So I could take a paper towel and kind of scoop up some of that if I was really not unhappy with that. Okay, last is dry on dry. So dry on dry is just simply using ink, pretty dry ink on dry paper. And this is like how you would do details using a pen or a nib. So you don't want to put a whole lot of ink on your brush. And this is how you're going to create more crisp lines. I could even have put a little less water on my brush. If I would have dabbed it on the paper towel, it probably would have been even more crisp. And just kind of play around making some lines. All right, so next I just want you to play around with your different brushes. So make sure you have a different style of brush, so a flat or a round, maybe a larger one, a smaller one. I might have a few fan brushes in there. Just see what I kind of have over there. And play around making different lines. So remember, to make different lines, it is the angle you're holding the brush and also the amount of pressure. So you can make different lines with the same brush just by how you're holding it. A flat brush is really good for a nice crisp edge. A round brush is kind of good for shading. You have to kind of figure out which ones you're comfortable with and that you like. And then you can see, depending on how I hold that flat brush, I can make a really thin, crisp line, or I can make a really nice, thick, flat line. So I really want you to kind of play around with it so you can get an idea of what you can do with these different types of brushes. And then finally we're going to do some pens. So if I have some of those calligraphy pens, they have different types of nibs. So the nibs is just the point on it. If you like to do illustration or manga or comic art, you might want to be interested in learning more about these too. So you just dip it in the ink, and then you're just going to pull with it. And then you can see it makes a really nice crisp line. So that's why these are really good for illustration, calligraphy. Calligraphy ones usually have a little wider nib. You can also use a toothpick or anything else, a bamboo skewer. And I apologize that I'm a little bit off my screen. And last, I want you to create a shaded sphere. Remember, we always start with the sphere, so I want you to try to do this in India ink. And you can do this in a pencil. I'm just doing this in a pen so you can see it. So I want you to practice creating a 3D shaded sphere. So just remember, you have your highlight, midtone, shadow, cast shadow. So I did a wet wash, and then I'm just dropping in some ink down there. And you might need to have some wait time between this. Since I'm just trying to get this demo done for you, I'm just going to kind of dab with a paper towel where the highlight is, and I'm going to drop in a darker value for the cast shadow. Now you have to be really careful, because if there's two wet sections of the paper touching, that ink is going to flow right into the wet section. So I'm having to be pretty careful that I don't do that. Then I'm going to drop in a darker value in my shadow. And I'm just kind of trying to kind of tease the ink into where I want it to go. And then using that paper towel is also kind of important to kind of blend, because I'm trying to not get that dark value up into that highlight. So this is where it probably would have been a better idea for me to wait, but I was trying to make this video for you, so I'm just being a little impatient. But no harm in using the paper towel. And then I'm just dropping in darker values there. I'm trying to leave the reflection in there, so I'm trying to keep the ink from going into the reflection. And then don't forget, it does dry a little bit lighter. So if it's not dark enough once it dries, you can always go back in. All right, so there's your sampler. So don't forget, when you're finished, to clean up, rinse your brushes, rinse the palette, leave them on the towel to dry. And then good job. Don't forget to let me check it off before you move on to the next thing.